Didn't expect this at all.
Welcome to WatchMojoUK, and today we're counting down our picks for the most awkward and uncomfortable reveals on Who Do You Think You Are? We're looking at even more moments that are awkward for the celebrities and the viewers at home, as they're often presented with uncomfortable truths about British history.
Before we begin, we publish new content every day, so be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell to get notified about our latest videos.
Roger de Mortimer is my lover.
Okay.
Number 20. Shotgun Wedding.
That does really shock me, because even now you'd get a bit of a move on down the aisle.
Tracking his mother's family history, Graeme Norton travelled to Northern Ireland to trawl through historical records in Belfast. He found out that his great-grandmother Mary had been 8 months pregnant when she walked down the aisle, something she seemed to keep from the rest of her family, because none of them ever knew.
My grandmother would have been mortified if she'd known this. That her mother had been 8 months pregnant going down the aisle.
This was in 1895, and while pregnancies out of wedlock have always been common, they were certainly heavily stigmatised. It also looks like Mary herself was illegitimate, as she had no father listed on her birth or marriage certificate.
It just mean my grandmother was so strict. Even my mother would be so awkward.
It's not awkward by today's standards, but as Norton says, if other members of the family had known, Mary never would have been viewed the same.
What I'm thinking about is good, I'm not the first person to bring shame on the family. But
Number 19. Family Murderer.
And on the very instant that they appeared, they were knocked down and received many desperate stabs.
In this shocking moment, Emma Willis traces her ancestry to Ireland and then finds out that one of her ancestors, Richard Fowler, was an aristocratic gentleman and a criminal.
On their arrival at the guardhouse, they were again stabbed with bayonets.
It was reported that Fowler had been involved in a violent attack, after which he'd been denounced as an Orange man and murderer in a pro-United Irishman propaganda paper. He was eventually taken to court, and thankfully the two victims of the attack, the Egans, survived.
They did survive, so they weren't killed on that night.
It's grisly to find out that one of your ancestors was involved in such a brutal episode of violence.
Because it's hard, after reading this, to think he was a good man.
Things get even more unsettling when she wonders whether he may have still been a good man despite this.
I felt quite sick when I was reading it, because it's so detailed.
Number 18. The Turkish Connection.
Then here his name is Osman.
Osman Wilfred.
Sex boy, name and surname of Father Ali Kemal.
Years before becoming Prime Minister, Boris Johnson traced his roots on Who Do You Think You Are? You may have thought that as one of the UK's most prominent toffs, he'd already have known exactly what his ancestry was, but apparently not. Talking to his father, it seems that perhaps his grandmother wasn't related to French nobility as she claimed, but it was his grandfather, Wilfred, who had the most fascinating story.
She was called, I think, Johnson as a maiden name. Ali Kemal himself was not present at birth, and she effectively, Gran, my father used to call her, brought them up.
He was half Turkish, and the family name was originally Kemal, but it was changed by Wilfred's grandmother, Boris's great-great-grandmother, to Johnson, to sound more British. The awkward moment, though, is when Stanley Johnson laments not being the Kemals for an outrageous reason.
Well, of course, it might have been a jolly good thing to be a Kemal. If I was Kemal, I might be on the Tory A-list, in this new multicultural Britain from now on.
Number 17. Slave Owners.
1839 would have been 5 years since the abolition of slavery in 1834.
Martin Humes from JLS headed to Jamaica to learn about his ancestry over there, only to come face to face with an appalling piece of history. He finds out that his family owns an estate, Comfort Hall, in Jamaica, after it was acquired generations ago by his ancestor, John B. Williams. Williams and his wife Emily bought the land originally.
Your 4 times great-grandfather receives compensation of £53 and 3 shillings for 2 persons who were enslaved on his property at Comfort Hall.
Humes later reads a record that, after the abolition of slavery in Jamaica, John and Emily were paid compensation by the British government for the loss of 2 slaves they owned. Martin was horrified to learn that despite being black themselves, his ancestors had owned slaves.
You're saying that John Williams was a slave master on Comfort Hall?
White persons in Jamaica and large landowners were not the only persons who owned enslaved people.
Number 16. Forgotten war hero.
I find it pretty amazing that my mum's grandfather has been completely forgotten, considering he fought in the First World War.
There were a lot of questions in Cheryl's family history, including why her grandmother was shrouded in mystery. Her mother Joan knew there was a whole other side of the family that she'd never met, and wanted to find out why. She finds out that her great-grandfather's name was Joseph Wilson Ridley, but that he wasn't married to her great-grandmother, Edith Annie.
Joseph was never really discussed in our family, other than referenced in rather derogatory terms as Old Man Ridley.
An anonymous letter from a relative she's never met revealed that Edith Annie was Ridley's housekeeper, who scandalously fell pregnant with twins after the death of his first wife. He could also be a violent drunk, despite being a war hero, and they believed that these violent traits were hereditary.
A Ridley trait is that most of us have a quick temper, and from what I've been told, Grandad Ridley was no exception. Some in the family say he was troubled and volatile, and his temper would often be fueled by excessive drinking.
Number 15. The Industrial School.
The idea underpinning the industrial school is that you train kids of the poor to be useful citizens.
TV legend Ricky Tomlinson wanted to know what happened to an ancestral brood of 7 children, particularly what happened to the youngest 2, Thomas and Mary Ann.
It's unlikely that Mary would have chosen to put her kids in here. If we look at the boys' register, we find Thomas, who's 2 years older than Mary Ann.
They ended up in an industrial school ostensibly to learn a trade, but in the logs, it seems like their mother abandoned them to this fate. But the conditions in the school were appalling.
The close, disagreeable and unwholesome atmosphere of some of the sleeping wards is aggravated by wet beds. These beds are not removed and changed daily, as they should be.
So these kids are sleeping in each other's urine?
Eventually, they find out that the children's mother, Mary, actually got remarried later, in her 40s, and had even more children. It turns out, though, that it was likely that she put the kids into the school to save them from abject poverty, because she wasn't going to be able to look after them. It was an appalling state of affairs.
Mary has been left utterly destitute, with no choice but to put her 2 youngest children into the industrial school.
They've gone into the workhouse and she's had a whole new family.
Number 14. Accidental poisoning.
Death from poisoning by carbolic acid, accidentally administered. Oh, for goodness sake. Wow! By whom?
What could be more awkward than accidentally poisoning your own wife? Very few things, as singer Leslie Garrett found out when she learnt this surprising bit of information.
The medicine bottle was also on the mantel shelf, and it too was labelled and similar in shape to the one containing the poison.
She was bizarrely over the moon to learn that something so thrilling had happened in her family history, reading through a newspaper article about how her great-grandfather said he'd accidentally given her carbolic acid instead of medicine.
My great-grandfather just said sorry, gave her the wrong bottle, and he was believed.
There was always the idea, though, that it wasn't an accident, and that maybe her great-grandfather had committed murder and gotten away with it. But regulations about medicine bottles used to be very lax, and it was a surprisingly common way to go.
But people were very concerned about this. There were about 200 deaths a year due to carbolic acid swallowed.
Number 13. Russian roulette.
But was it a common thing to do, to play Russian roulette here?
Not that I know of, but I think it was with Tom.
Alan Cumming headed out to Malaysia to trace the footsteps of Tom Darling, his grandfather, and unravel the mystery of how he died so young and so suddenly. Darling was a police lieutenant who died of a gunshot wound to the head, and there was initially some mystery around whether it had been self-inflicted.
I'm sorry to have to say that to you.
Oh, don't worry, I want to
And as I say, I wasn't holding his hand at the time it happened.
Cumming initially thought it might not have been, and that perhaps, as a colonial police officer, he got on somebody's bad side. especially after hearing stories of the kinds of hideous things officers used to do. But then came the revelation that he'd actually died playing Russian roulette with the locals, something he used to do regularly.
What state of mind must he have been in to be getting his kicks from being in some little bar, putting a gun to his head.
Number 12. Prison visit.
To serve from the date hereof for the term of 7 years. Wow. To be fully complete and ended.
He can't go away at all without his master's permission.
Amanda Holden wanted to unravel the mystery of why one of her Georgian ancestors, Colin Thomas, had been sent to prison for 12 months down in Exeter at a shockingly young age, when he was still only a teenager. It turned out that he'd been stuck as an apprentice, but wanted to join the Marines to go and fight Napoleon, only for his master to return and reclaim him, so he got dismissed.
Charged with unlawfully having knowingly,
by false
pretences, obtained the sum of £11 and 11 shillings.
11 guineas, in other words.
Yeah.
But he was then charged with unlawfully obtaining money, though that money was his money from the Marines. Parts of the building still existed, but much of the underground cells were a toilet block now, so we got to watch Amanda take a tour of some dingy men's toilets in the dark.
The men's toilets, which is grim anyway. I mean, I can't help but think, I mean, he was only 15.
Number 11. The She-Wolf of France.
I'll try. Nah, it's all gone wrong, my little sweets. I'll try and get out of here with some grace, as a king would.
This made for uncomfortable viewing, not because Danny Dyer made yet another monumental discovery about his lineage, but because he had a very awkward encounter with a cast member at a stately home. She's playing Isabella, the She-Wolf of France, King Edward II's ferocious wife who had no time for Edward's dalliances with his male favourites.
Where have you been? Have you been out with Hugh bloody Dispenser? First it was Piers bloody Gaveston, and now it's Hugh. Now I'm gonna chop his bloody balls off.
There were extremely awkward moments in this segment, as Danny was asked to sail into Leeds Castle in a rowboat, in a rare instance of Who Do You Think You Are, apparently trying to become a comedy show. The entire section was bizarre.
You only slept with me because you wanted an heir.
Yeah?
Well, I should have never married an English bloke.
Can we just stop shouting and hollering?
Especially not one that prefers guys to girls.
Ah, yeah.
Number 10. Squatting complaint.
However, remember that he was squatting and they'll have to be quiet and they have to blow out the candle and make sure they stay in the dark.
EastEnders star Rose Ayling-Ellis found out that her family history is closer to the fictional soap than first assumed. She found out that her family were pub landlords in days gone by, and that one of her ancestors was once fined for assault after drunkenly slapping a customer.
The vent was very drunk and he came up to him and slapped him in the face.
Later though, she investigated an old family story that they'd once been squatting and found out that it wasn't true.
But they're not squatting because they rented.
You're right, they were paying rent.
They were, in fact, paying tenants, but somebody made a complaint against them, which led to them trying to be as quiet and non-disruptive as possible. The source of the complaint? Kids accidentally throwing a ball over the neighbouring workhouse's wall while playing. They were actually evicted because of this.
Requirement along the neighbour have failed to prove any evidence of disturbance. Indeed, the evidence available goes to show that the Willis family are in bed at 10 o'clock at night.
Number 9. Con artist.
At Westminster Police Court, W. Morris Crouch, otherwise Morris Beethoven, late of Ebury Street, Pimlico, was brought up in custody. Oh my God.
Fiona Bruce had a photographer in her family history, but he seemed to lose an awful lot of money, and she wanted to find out where it was going. So she started investigating William Crouch, her great-great-grandfather, by going through photography journals. But it turned out he was a criminal and had been arrested for defrauding people. He'd been asking potential photography apprentices to pay him large deposits, keeping the money for himself.
The prisoner entered into agreements undertaken to make repayment of the deposits, but at the time his affairs were at the lowest pecuniary ebb.
He was caught and ordered to pay, but the money was already gone. The evidence stacked up, and he ultimately pled guilty back in 1904, getting a 5-month sentence and causing a scandal.
Obligation, so that is why he took on so many pupils and assistants, to fleece them. The pupils had little or nothing to do. For some time, the defendant had not a camera on his establishment.
Number 8. Family farms.
They were tenants, what we call tenants at will, so they didn't have a lease.
Throughout the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th, Ireland was in the grips of the Irish Land War, in which the Irish people demanded reform from the country's rich, landowning families.
At the time, the English Crown was seizing land from Irish Catholics and giving it to loyal English Protestant families, like the Palmers.
Julie Walters found out that some of her family, generations ago, were tenants under this system, living in a house owned by an English landlord, Roger Palmer. It's one of many dark chapters in British history and is a very striking moment when the historian shows the enormous manor house Palmer lived in, paid for by the unwilling tenants across Ireland.
The owners of the land were that privileged, wealthy minority.
Living off the backs of these poor people.
Her family, the Clarks, were also affected by failing crops and potato blights and ended up unable to pay their rent.
Just the thought of having 4 small children and also the land not being brilliant land.
Number 7. Gardening drama. Sir Bruce Forsyth went all the way to America after being contacted by a long-lost relative in the States. He finds out that his great-grandfather, Joseph Forsyth Johnson, worked on Prospect Park in Brooklyn, New York, in the 19th century.
8 trees were cut, 12 were marked for cutting, and it was made to seem as though, again, he was clear-cutting the park.
But he was ousted when the public decided that his attempts to cut down a few trees to rejuvenate the park were actually an attempt to raze it and cut down all the trees.
The park royal.
Royal.
And you see here the next sub-headline. Joseph Forsyth Johnson gone. So despite...
He was forcibly removed by the park commissioner, trading barbs in newspapers with the park department while trying to demand that they give him a fair hearing. More shocking, Forsyth later finds out that Joseph may have been a bigamist.
He says that Commissioner Summers is only a mechanic and that some people cannot tell sticks from trees.
Number 6. Dodgy stockbroker.
And here in, I think, 1862 is another reference to him dealing or brokering gold mining in Wales.
Some of Rupert Everett's relatives are shrouded in mystery, among them his great-great-grandfather Frederick. While searching archives in the British Library, Everett found that he'd been working as a stockbroker for various mining companies.
Investors were encouraged to direct their money into speculative schemes with little official oversight.
But perhaps those mining companies weren't as lucrative as people thought, because he was ultimately arrested for attempting to defraud people by selling them shares and then just pocketing the money, a scam as old as time.
Charge of fraud against a stockbroker. Yesterday, Mr. Frederick Everett, a stockbroker, again appeared before the Lord Mayor.
It's always unpleasant to find out that one of your ancestors may have been a criminal, though the case was dismissed due to lack of evidence. Frederick ultimately went bankrupt and died of TB. Number 5. The Lodger's Secret.
Oh, yes, there he is. James Arthur Edwards. And he's there with Mabel. And who's Frederick Ernest Nash, who's living there as well?
Leslie Manville traced her grandparents back to 1918 and found out that her grandfather had been living with a woman named Mabel and another man, Frederick Nash, who was their lodger. She finds out that Mabel and Frederick had an affair and a child, and her grandfather James moved out of the house, leaving them to it.
Father's name and surname is Frederick Ernest Nash, and the mother is Mabel Edwards. Oh my goodness.
James moved on from the marriage to Mabel with a woman named Harriet, Leslie's grandmother. It was all very dramatic and difficult to unravel, but seemed to boil down to how it was almost impossible for working class people to afford to get divorced at the time, so her grandparents weren't legally married.
So these couples who are cohabiting without getting divorced, without being able to marry each other, whilst it's not a norm, it's certainly not that unusual.
Number 4. Abandoned.
Your mother was with this family only for 1 month, for a very, very short period of time.
Like Leslie Manville, Lulu had an old family mystery she wanted to solve. Why was her mother, one of 7 children, given up to another family? And why was it only her?
I have to say I'm feeling very angry with my grandparents. Willy-nilly having babies all over the place.
It certainly is awkward to learn information that makes you angry at your grandparents, though, and that's what happened. Elizabeth was the fourth-born child, and when only a few months old, she was given away willingly by her parents. Lulu found out that it was because they didn't have any money, and her grandfather was in and out of prison.
Child went to school yesterday for the first time and is very pleased with herself.
Elizabeth's birth parents initially failed to pay the first family to take her, and she found another, permanent home that thankfully took good care of her.
In a lot of respects, your mother has been a very, very fortunate child.
Yes, and that's what my uncle James said. She was lucky.
Number 3, strike-breaking ancestor.
He's in a turret, chucking stones at them.
Something like that.
Pretty much.
Yes.
Jack Whitehall and his father Michael wanted to learn about their ancestor, Thomas Jones Phillips, who was a solicitor involved in monitoring industrial disputes in Wales in the 1830s. Phillips was tailing the Chartists, who, among other things, wanted universal male suffrage, that is, the right for all men, regardless of class, to vote.
Oh, no. It is our ancestor Thomas Jones Phillips. He's the dodgy emissary that's come to the meeting in like a bad disguise.
It's not that surprising to find out that someone as posh as Jack Whitehall had dodgy ancestors, but discovering that Phillips disguised himself to spy on the Chartists and report back about their activities was deeply reprehensible.
They're forming mobs and they're heading down towards Newport, and our ancestor is trailing them in his first-class coach, monitoring them at every point.
He was also involved in trying to convict many Chartists after a lethal riot, all in exchange for a cash reward he claimed not to know about. Number 2, the Orange Order.
My father was, he was an orange man.
Oh, he was?
He was, aye.
David Tennant has always had strong connections to the church, with his father being a minister in the Church of Scotland. But he was completely unprepared to go to Northern Ireland and meet some distant Protestant relatives, discovering that one of them was in the Orange Order.
Was William in a lodge as well?
I don't know.
Right.
You could probably follow that through maybe through the Memorial Hall.
They told him this as he sat down for a cuppa and brought out an orange sash to show him, giving it to him to take to a nearby memorial hall and ask more questions about the relatives he didn't even know he had until recently. He talked to the camera crew about how disturbed he was to be given this information and handed the sash itself.
How did you feel when you were handed that sash?
Not great. Even now, I'm not that comfortable holding it.
Number 1, slave-owning history.
This is shocking.
This episode made for very upsetting viewing, as TV chef Ainsley Harriet went to Jamaica to learn about his ancestor James Gordon Harriet. Nobody was prepared to learn that his family actually owned slaves in Jamaica at one point, and that his surname, Harriet, came from distant white ancestors.
So this was something that was passed down through the family, learning the skill and art
of purchasing your slaves.
Harriet and his family had previously assumed that they were descended from black slaves on Jamaica, so discovering this shook him to his core. It's very difficult information to come to terms with, as the historian pointed out how many slaves his family had once owned.
He owned 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 slaves.
I can see that.
No, actually.
Let us know which celeb's family history surprised you the most.
One moment you're feeling this almost hatred for people who dominated and controlled and...
Do you agree with our picks? Check out this other recent clip from WatchMojoUK and be sure to subscribe and ring the bell to be notified about our latest videos.